Hello again. We're now talking about the your questions from week 2, the Trajanic period on site, and appropriately the green screen, or rather the image that's replacing the green screen, is showing the Forum of Trajan in Rome, with the column. I'll just step out. Hopefully you can see there, but behind me. So why is this place so relevant to Portus?
Well, the clue lies in the name, of course. The Forum of Trajan is the great forum built by Trajan, and which commemorates his victories in Dacia, modern Romania, and was really kind of the ultimate showpiece of imperial power, and with his column, of course, recounting the events of the Dacian Wars and all sorts of iconography of Trajanic conquests inside. So it is one massive building project, one of several building projects in the capital, and part of a building programme of which Portus was kind of the last piece, his great showpiece outside the capital, alongside with Civitavecchia. So you have, in a way, to see the Trajan's Forum to kind of get an idea of other aspects to that building programme.
Okay, thank you very much. So my next question for you is the hardest question in week 2, which was asking, what was the total area that was enclosed by all 3 harbour basins at Portus, following its enlargement by Trajan? And the answer was 234 hectares.
Right.
What I wanted to ask is how on earth was that volume of material moved, and how were the harbour basins of that size created?
Well, it's a complex question with a simple answer. I think, in essence, we're talking about lots and lots of workmen who are simply digging this out with picks and shovels, essentially. And carrying the earth off, and we're talking about sand in most areas and redepositing it in other areas, in the context of the replanning of the whole port complex that the Trajanic enlargement entailed. So one has to think of that, and just to give you an idea of scale, one's thinking perhaps something in the region of 2 million cubic metres of sand for the Trajanic basin, which of course is the last of the 3. But it doesn't stop there, because of course the Trajanic basin, as you will all know, was surrounded by quays which were built from concrete, and that concrete is made up of different elements, sand, lime and so forth, aggregate, which comes from the surrounding area. One then has to think in terms of the bricks for the buildings and other construction material, a lot of which comes from the Tiber Valley. So all that has to be transported down. There are all the transport logistics. One's talking about thousands of people involved. And it seems quite a lot of times people ask me about this and they say, well, obviously it's slaves. And I personally don't think so. And I think it's actually, there's a clever trick here, that I think a lot of the people involved here were quite probably free men, free people, who were getting temporary occupation either from Ostia or from Rome, and it was a way, kind of a massive imperial job creation scheme. So you keep the populace employed and busy, but at the same time you get this fantastic great port out of it. So you know, it's complex.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. All right, so now going on to the questions in descending order of how much they've been liked by you all, and this just to prove, this will prove that I'm doing this, you know, properly. The first one is a little bit critical. We have a step and a series of discussions about whether archaeology is an art, humanities, or a science, and several people quite rightly said, let's just get on with it. Does this really matter? Why are we actually concerned as to whether archaeology is an art or a humanities or a science? Do you want to address that?
Well, yes. I mean, I personally think that archaeology is kind of the perfect sort of combining discipline, if you like. We're interested in human behaviour. We're interested in trying to write history, if you like, from material evidence. So we analyse what's been left behind. So that's kind of, and so it helps us understand human behaviour, social structure, commerce and things of these kinds. But at the same time, we can't really do that properly unless we use scientific techniques, because of course, if we want to find out where a stone or a piece of pottery has come from, the pottery in itself won't tell you anything. So you have to analyse it, use scientific techniques to try and trace it back. The same is true if we use isotopic analysis of grain, for example, trying to work out where that comes from. So the science is being used to help us address questions that are of interest to scholars in the humanities. So it's the perfect blend, I like to think, of humanities and science.
I mean, the one, I suppose, additional part I'd say is, I think it's also crucial that we are a bit critical of the different types of discipline, because each type of discipline brings its own biases, its own understanding of what, truth is, objectivity is, what the different methods imply. So that, I think that's another reason why we have to be thinking holistically about how these things interact.
Well, we do, and not only that, we also have to, it's not enough to use a bit of scientific approach or piece of evidence. We have to understand what it is we're doing. As you say, we have to understand the limitations of each of those bits of evidence in order that we can weight them appropriately in our arguments. So that's why, as I often say, I think archaeology is actually one of the most intellectually challenging disciplines of all. We straddle so many disciplines: sociology, anthropology, history, science, so forth and so on, and yet we have to produce nuanced arguments that satisfies the specialist but also addresses our own questions.
Okay, well, so that'll be something else you can feed back on now we've recorded that. Okay, so the next one. So in one of the extra videos we recorded on site last year, there was reference to stamps that have a dot design, purely dots rather than any other kind of representation. What can we tell about those? And so there was one suggestion: is it because the person who was making it was couldn't write, or they were from a different country that didn't have the same traditions? Why are they like that?
This kind of goes back to the previous question in the sense that all we find are impressions. The impressions per se tell us very little. It might be in the shape of a trident, it might be in the shape of an L or whatever. We don't know is a simple answer. Right. Having said that, I think there are certain things that we can discount. I mean, I don't think it means that it comes from another country, that we could tell anyway by looking at the fabric of the pottery, the ceramic of which the tile is made. I personally think it tells us something about the control measures that are used in production of the bricks. So in the same way that the more complex stamps that we find in the late 1st and 2nd century, the ones, the circular ones, I think you will have all seen, those tell us about date, workshop and so forth. The fact that these tend to be later, in other words late 2nd century, early 3rd, and the fact that they don't have that, I think tells us in an argument ex silentio that different kinds of control procedures are in place. So for whatever reason, the workshops perhaps aren't working in that way, and perhaps there are different systems in keeping track of how things are moving. So it's not the kind of simple, exciting answer, but it gives you the kind of an idea of the fuzziness with how we have to deal with things that aren't actually self-explanatory. Okay,
well the next one will increase the fuzziness. So, because this is one getting at the heart, I suppose, of a perceived divide between academic processes and practices and sort of a quote-unquote real-life experience. So if we return to the idea, the example on the comment is about plumbers, but let's go back to the idea of digging out of the Harbour Basin.
Okay.
What is it that how does academic archaeology interact with experts who might be builders or people who are used to excavating large areas or used to constructing harbour installations? How does archaeology as an academic discipline interact with those kinds of people and that kind of, well, you might say in an academic way, embodied knowledge?
That's a difficult one. I think that all too often in the past, if I'm getting the question right, archaeologists have tended to be very self-referential. So you're investigating a port, you interpret it in terms of what you know about earlier publications and what the sources tell us. And I personally think that we have to move beyond that. And certainly, the tortoise again, one of the biggest challenges for us, I think, is that we have a series of basins connected by canals and so forth. We really don't understand how they work. And on the one hand, Earl, as you've seen, with his cores and everything else, has been looking at sediment size, and that gives us a kind of clue as to the kinds of water and the water velocity that's passing through them, but that doesn't answer the question completely. So it is important, therefore, to start talking to people who work in ports today and to try and understand how they understand the logistics of a major port like this. How is information, for example, circulated around the port? How is traffic regulated? All these kinds of things. So we don't do it enough, is my simple answer, and we need to do more. I think,
and I think it was just a quick follow-up. I would say that I think we are doing it increasingly. So there's already a long tradition of doing reconstruction archaeology projects. So we're physically recreating things, and that would involve a wide variety of people. Some fantastic work at Conington, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
So and that's where we're learning directly from the physical process of building things or of knocking them down. So I think that we're doing it much more, and we certainly don't prejudice one kind of knowledge and experience over another one.
No, I think that's very true.
Okay, so kind of another one referring to somebody else, another kind of discipline. I wondered how business transactions were looked after. I mean, was there some kind of do we think the Imperial Palace, if it was an administrative location, was filled with written documents that were managing process, or how was it done?
Well, that is a very difficult question, simply because obviously none of the evidence survives. So to answer it, we have to draw on little bits of evidence from Ostia on inscriptions, little bits of evidence from the juridical sources of antiquity, little bits of evidence from papyri in places like Egypt, and then we have to try and understand those bits in the context of what we understand of the port. But to cut a long story short, yes, I think the Imperial Palace is probably a place where a lot of the archives relating to the movement of commerce in and out of the port is kept. I think, however, that the body of state that would have been most interested in this would have been the office of the Praetorian Prefect at Rome. And so I imagine that a lot of these archives are fairly rapidly taken to a statio or an office at Ostia before then being taken up to the headquarters of the Praetorian, Prefect of the Annona at the Isola Tiberina, the Portus Tiberinus in Rome.
Okay, fabulous. So if we were to move on to the next question, so if I were to wander into the Imperial Palace or around the site, as I was listening, what languages would I hear people speaking on the site? Would it be a great variety, and what kinds of examples, or was there more consistency?
Again, it kind of comes back to evidence. We're hidebound by the evidence that we have. Epigraphic evidence from Portus isn't as great as Ostia, but if we put the two together, the kind of thing we could expect to hear would have been lots of Latin. We would have heard Greek too. Primarily those two languages, I think. Languages from beyond the empire, I think, rather less. Although, who knows? We have evidence of pepper from our excavations, which suggests trade with the East, and indeed ostrich egg shells, which suggests contact with Africa beyond Egypt. So who knows? That could have come through Roman merchants, or it could have come through merchants from those far places.
Okay, Brill, thank you. We've run out of time. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back tomorrow with week 3.